Today we've got a few stories that are all about revenge. So sit back, grab some popcorn, and let's have some fun. First up, rule number 1. Don't cheat on me. In 2008, I met this amazingly awesome girl in school. Let's call her CR. I was 21, and she was just about to turn 19. We both knew what love was for the first time in our lives. We were both going to a community college, me for theater design and her for education. We lived about half an hour apart, but that was nothing more than a minor inconvenience because we spent every free moment between classes together. Come to think of it, that slight distance was actually pretty nice because being home at least forced us to focus on homework and taking care of ourselves. And visiting each other at home was that much more special. CR graduated with her associates in 2009 and moved away to a state school to finish up her degree in early childhood special education. Like before, the distance was not a concern because it was just a short train ride away, and I'd spend 1 or 2 weekends a month down there with her. I proposed to her on Valentine's Day, 2010. School really wasn't my thing, and I ended up enlisting in the United States Air Force that following May and got moved halfway across the country to a place neither of us had ever imagined visiting. However, like before, we wouldn't let distance get in our way. Now it should be noted that her mom did not like me. I still don't know why, but she was always the loudest, rudest, most annoying and disrespectful, mean lady I've ever met. She was from the city, and she married into a family of farmers that owned the land since the 1870s, so that may explain part of her malice. From here on, we'll call her EB for evil. You get the picture. Another thing to know is that I have a great memory, and this will be important later on in the story. Anyway, back to the military. I had a 2-week break between my training and leaving for my first, and only, duty station, which just happened to be over Christmas and New Year's. Even though we were engaged, we hadn't really put any consideration into actually getting married. She wanted something small with her family and cousins, and I was completely okay with going to a courthouse and getting it over with. I don't want to sound like I was trying to pressure her into that, but the way I saw it, I would be living in barracks in a few weeks, and being married would get me a full monthly housing allowance, which I would save to have a wedding ceremony when we had time in another year or two. Basically, get married now, don't tell anyone, because they would all get the hella upset for not being involved, and have a fake wedding ceremony that would include both of our families and friends. It turns out that because I was living in barracks, I wasn't allowed to collect the housing allowance, and when 6 months later, they realized I was actually married, kicked me out, and made me get a house on base. Either way, we didn't get married when I was home on leave and took an Amtrak train out west. I highly recommend traveling across country by train if you have the time. The first time we were able to see each other after that was during her spring break, which was the first part of March. CR and I finally eloped in a courthouse and spent the next few days glued to each other, P&V style, like every young married couple should. I flew back home for a couple weeks in June, and this is when things started to unravel. Easter Seals, for those who don't know, run summer camps for special needs kids, and my new wife volunteered to be a counselor for the last 7 weeks of the summer. The last time I saw her that summer was just after her June birthday when I dropped her off at camp. The rest of the summer was hit or miss getting in touch with her since she was on the clock 24 hours a day for 5 days a week, and I completely understood her commitment to those kids. When she was back in school the following fall, she became increasingly distant, making excuses about how her phone would be randomly dead at oddly predictable times every week. She flew out to spend Christmas with me in our new house, technically a crappy, mostly empty duplex, and things felt amazing like they had been. After that, however, she went back to being super reclusive like she was the previous semester. Fast forward to May 2012, it took a whole month of leave to fly home for her graduation and to help her move in with me. I barely recognized her. Every bit of CR's communication with me was forced and so phony that I should have known what was really happening all along. She had set up what she called mock interviews with a couple grade schools near her hometown, and I actually believed that she was doing it just to get experience interviewing. What an idiot. When I finally started to catch on how serious she was about getting a job in her home state, she broke down crying and made it seem like I was forcing her to choose between me and her career. And of course, I wanted to put our marriage before anything else. Obviously, I returned to base without her. A couple weeks later, I pressured her into telling me what the hell was going on. She fell in love with one of her fellow camp counselors and let the affair go on for about 9 months, with claims that she was going to tell me but didn't know when. The usual, Too guilty to tie your own shoes BS. And she honestly expected me to walk away from our relationship right then and there. No. I fought tooth and nail to hold us together for 2 months before filing the divorce. I'm skipping a bunch of sappy details here, but the divorce was filed late August and became final that December. Mandatory 90-day waiting period in my state. The pain I suffered in that one-sided relationship is something I would never wish on anybody, unless that truly deserved it. Apparently, EB whispered all kinds of lies to her about how I joined the military to get away from her, and actually had the gall to blame me for all the crying and misery her oldest child was going through. My soon-to-be ex never admitted who was blaming me for everything, but I was really close to her dad and siblings, so I can't imagine that they would ever suspect me. But EB was so manipulative that by Halloween, they had all turned against me. And at that point, I had it. I was near suicidal, and my anxiety attacks were hitting basically every day. I was miserable, tired of being lied to, tired of the slander, tired of being the bad guy when I was the one who was attacked here. It started with sending texts to her brothers and sisters saying, "Hey, I'm actually your brother-in-law. Nice to know that we don't keep secrets, right?" CR exploded, but that was just the beginning. I wrote a 3,000-word letter explaining in every detail I could recall exactly what happened. The fact that we were married, including copies of the marriage license and certificate, our plans for the future, and how I was the only one living up to our expectations. Where she met the guy she was cheating with, his name, address, phone number, camp counselor name so CR would have a harder time refuting it, and a bunch of other information that she made me keep secret from them. I sent copies to everyone in her extended family. Well, everyone I had an address for. Her roommates, the summer camp she worked at, close professors she had brought up in old conversations, and the principal of the school she ended up working at. Calling the fallout catastrophic is an understatement. Her super devout Catholic family basically disowned her. Her reputation at her former school was shattered, and the tension at her new job was apparently high enough that CR was forced to resign from her position before Christmas break started. Getting those secrets off my chest was the most cathartic moment of my life. Wow. Good for you, OP. Hopefully that helped you put your life back together and keep on trucking. In our next story, ex-husband gets what he deserves after he cheats on my sister. For some clarifications, this story takes place in a third world country in Asia. Laws are different here from the first world and Western countries. This took place in the Philippines. Our country is a conservative and Catholic country, so marriage and married life is held sacred, and any idea of divorce or separation of spouses is frowned upon by most traditionalists. We are basically the island version of Texas and Alabama, where there's lots of hardcore Bible thumpers. This story happened a few years ago when I was about to go to college. My cousin and her husband had been married for a year or so by then, but haven't had much success in conceiving a child. We live in a Southeast Asian country, and surrogacy isn't legal for some reason, so that option was not in the cards for them. They talked about adopting, but both of them really wanted a child of their own. Anyway, after a few months more of trying, they decided to just postpone it for a while, considering they're still young, as both are in their early 30s. Contrary to popular belief, women can still get pregnant at 30 until 39. 40 is the high-risk, slim chance age. They instead decided to focus on their respective careers and travel whenever possible. All in all, they were having a great life. On the outside, that is. About a few months later, my sister noticed a few things. Nothing too drastic. Like her husband would receive these late-night calls. Husband is a doctor, and he would go to the other room to take it. Her husband always clearing the history in their shared desktop computer at home. Him having to go overtime way too often. Sister asked me and some of our cousins on what to do. At the time, I was dating a guy pretty tech-savvy, who on multiple occasions hacked my Facebook, but that is for another story, so I asked him for help. Within 2 days, we had his Facebook, Gmail, and Instagram account. We found nothing. I thought, okay, weird. Maybe sis is being paranoid. Then I had a thought. What about his Viber? After a bit more digging, we were able to get a hold of his Viber, and boy did we find things. This a-hole had been cheating on her for almost half a year. We found dozens and dozens of messages between him and some girl. In one of the messages, the girl even admits that even though he is married, she loves him and likes the thrill of being with a married man. It made me and my boyfriend then sick. The girl was just a few years older than me, in her early 20s. They're even exchanging nudes with each other and talking about their little hookup. I was absolutely heartbroken. My older sister always wanted a family of her own, And this scumbag, whom she thought was the love of her life, had just did this to her. I told my boyfriend to save all of it in a hard drive and log out of the accounts. I was hesitant at first to tell my sister, but I knew she deserved the truth. A few days after debating it with myself, I finally showed her everything. As expected, this broke her. She cried and cried. I was crying along with her as I didn't really like seeing her like this. After hours of us both sobbing, I decided to get revenge. My sister was never the vindictive type. She was often the timid girl who let people get away with everything because she didn't like confrontation. She was heavily bullied for this during her school years, according to our other cousins that were her age. Now for the revenge. I told my sister of the plan. As she wasn't really planning on revenge, she wanted to just file for an annulment. Divorce isn't legal here too. But I knew someone had to teach that jerk not to mess with our family. I told her to pretend everything was okay and that she was oblivious to his cheating. It took a good amount of coaxing, but she finally agreed. I decided we needed to catch them in the act because despite the overwhelming evidence, I had a hunch they would deny it. A week later, my sister called me and told me that her husband messaged her from his work. He told her that he might work overtime again at the hospital and would just be sleeping at their condo that was about 10 minutes away. She said sure and called me almost immediately. I smiled and told my sister to meet me at the restaurant across the condominium where her husband would be. I arrived there alone and waited for my sister. A few minutes later, she arrived. Lucky for us, their condo unit was outfitted with CCTV cameras you can view on your phone, tablet, computer. Husband was not fully aware of this since when they got the condo, it was my sister who took care of outfitting the unit with furniture and stuff. He only signed the paperwork with her at the beginning and rarely had a hand in it. It was supposed to be a rental unit, but husband convinced my sister to let him use it when he would need overtime at work so he can just sleep there and not have to drive the 1-hour journey he had to take to get to their house. We viewed the footage as we were sitting down having some drinks. Nothing yet. Husband wasn't there. An hour passed, and we see the front door open, and in walks husband with his mistress. At that moment, my sister was about to cry, but I told her that he wasn't worth crap, and it's time to confront them. We went to the unit and sneaked inside using my sister's key. They were in the bedroom, still getting it on, and I slammed the door open to see them doing it. Horrible mental picture. To say that these bastards were shocked would be an understatement. Their jaws were literally on the floor when they saw us. He tried explaining and rationalizing the situation, but I cut him off. I told him to shut up and prepare for a lawsuit. My sister was in tears at this point, and I had to drag her away as her douchebag of a husband was pleading. We drove her home and packed all of his crap up in boxes and his bags. The drive home was not pleasant as my sister was still bawling. I comforted her as best I could and told her she would be okay. He got home just a few minutes after we were done packing. She told him that he can't live in the house anymore and that she was leaving him. He said nothing, knowing my temper and the fact that if he tried lying, I would have his head then and there. Yeah, I know I'm a little ghetto, and loaded his things in his car. The next day, I got the evidence from the hard drive and sent it to the board of the directors of the hospital he worked in, the medical board, all his colleagues, friends, and family. I also sent out the evidence to the woman's family, friends, and to her boss and colleagues. The fallout was glorious. They both lost their jobs, husband even had his license revoked, and his parents disowned him. One of our cousins was a lawyer, and he helped our sister sue him and the woman for concubinage, Philippines' legal term for adultery. She won the case and was granted an annulment, and she got most of their assets in the separation, the house, the condo, cars, and money. Her husband got a bit of money, but he had to pay a hefty price for the lawyer since his parents refused to help him. I don't recall how many years they had to serve in jail, but since neither can afford bail, they would be spending a lot of time in a facility and have a permanent criminal record when they got out of jail. My sister's fine now. She's still healing from all that BS and is in a better headspace now. Wow, jail time. Philippines law be scary, y'all. Alright, next up. Boyfriend cheats on me with my step-sibling, so I get him kicked out and destroy his relationship with his parents. When I was around 17, I started dating a guy, 19. I'll call him Jake for the sake of this post. Also, age of consent where I live is 16, so nothing illegal happening here. We got on well, spent a lot of time together, and cared for each other a lot. We even started talking about living together once we both moved out. We were a perfectly happy couple. Or so I thought. You see, after we'd been dating for a few months, something in Jake changed. He was getting a lot more distant. Whenever he was with me, he'd be checking his phone constantly. We stopped spending as much time together, and he started to get really funny about public affection, regarding things like hand-holding and stuff. He also seemed to start caring less and less about my feelings. I used to have a bit of a thing for humiliation in the bedroom, nothing too far, and we'd spoken about what Jake should and shouldn't say, but he started to get more and more degrading. He'd tell me how no one would ever love me and would pick on my insecurities. I actually broke down crying a few times when this happened. To give him a bit of credit, the first few times he did stop everything he was doing and apologize and cuddle with me until I felt better. But eventually, that stopped too, and he just began rolling his eyes and telling me to grow up. He was like a completely different person. The insults started to seep into our everyday life. He'd pick on my appearance a lot, bring up my family. I was dealing with a lot of family issues at the time. Bring up the fact that I slept around before we started dating, a sort of rebellion caused by the family issues, etc. If I got upset by it, he'd just leave the room and let me cry by myself. I started to feel like it was my fault our relationship was falling apart. Maybe I just wasn't good enough for him. I knew deep down that he was cheating on me, and that was confirmed when I got a message from a guy, David, on Facebook, telling me that he'd been sleeping with Jake. He apologized profusely and told me that he broke things off with Jake as soon as he found out he had a boyfriend. I couldn't be mad at David. It wasn't his fault. We spoke for hours, and I reassured David that it wasn't his fault and that he'd done nothing wrong. David also helped me to stop making excuses for Jake's attitude and the way he'd been acting. He was a godsend. The thing that truly broke me happened not too long after the cheating was discovered. We'd been arguing a hell of a lot more. Then he decided to do something absolutely unforgivable. You see, I had a strained relationship with my father for years. He'd cheat on my mother constantly, and eventually, he settled down and had kids with a girl he'd been seeing behind her back. He did try to have some sort of relationship with me till I was about 13 or 14-ish, and then decided that he didn't love me as much as his other kids, and we stopped any and all contact. It broke me, and it still hurts to think about it to this day. Anyway, Jake went out of his way to find one of my step-siblings online and slept with them. He bragged about it the next day, and my step-sibling actually posted online about what had happened, and I received a bunch of messages from their friends telling me how I had deserved it. That was probably the lowest point in my life, and I hated myself, partly for allowing it to happen, and partly because I had started to believe what they were saying. My only solace during this time was David. I didn't want to burden my friends with my problems, and David was one of the only people who knew, firsthand, what Jake was like. We spoke for a few weeks, and eventually talk turned to revenge. I had tried calling things off a couple months prior due to Jake's awful behavior, but he started with the apologies and telling me he didn't mean it, he'd never do it again. He even spoke to some of my family members who, unknowingly, pressured me to get back together with him, as we were such a sweet couple. I hadn't wanted to tell them the real reason that we'd broken up, so I kept the details pretty vague. Though I'm pretty sure some of them had seen my step-sibling's post and knew why I didn't want to be with him. After weeks of talking and planning, I had finally had enough and decided to do something about it. My father wasn't exactly a rich man, but he worked a pretty well-paying job and earned enough money to live fairly comfortably. He had begun spreading rumors around when I was younger, during a custody battle with my mother, that he had set up a trust fund for me and that there was enough money there to get me set up in my own place when I was 18, plus a bit extra. I knew that this was absolute BS. He tried to get out of paying child support all the time. Of course, he'd never set up a trust fund for me. However, Jake didn't. We'd never spoken about it a lot, but he'd heard the rumors, and I'd just always say what I told you folks. My father was an appalling parent who grudged paying my mother child support, so why the hell would he set up a trust fund? But Jake wouldn't listen. He even did his own research into the type of job my father worked and came up with an estimate of how much he thought my father was earning. Though, to his credit, he did drop the subject whenever I asked him to, for a while anyways. I decided to use this to my advantage. Jake and I were still dating, though I avoided him at any chance I got. Until one night, where I sat him down and told him that since I'd be turning 18 in a couple of weeks, I'd started thinking about us getting our own place, with the trust fund my father had set up for me. He immediately cheered up at this, and honestly, I think that night was the first time in months that he'd said anything nice to me when we weren't in public or with friends or family. This very nearly made me want to call the whole thing off, but I spoke with David later that night, and he reminded me that Jake would go back to his usual degrading attitude in no time. We started looking at flats, though Jake was kind enough to let me have the final say and handle the paperwork. Because how could he possibly go out and cheat on me if he had to sort out the paperwork for a flat? I was a little surprised by this, to be very honest, as I'd always thought that he'd want his name on the paperwork and everything so I couldn't kick him out. But by this point, he'd slept with my step-sibling, degraded me, smashed my self-confidence to pieces, and cheated on me regularly. I think by now, he thought that I wouldn't kick him out no matter what he did. Anyways, I started taking up extra shifts at work to try and save enough money to actually move out. Not with Jake, though. Oh, no. I was moving in with my friend, Emma. We had both been thinking about moving out for a while anyways, and though, why not just be roommates? We found a cute little one-bedroom flat that was close enough to our college and work and started getting stuff sorted to move in. I also didn't want to bring any trouble to my mother's door if Jake started kicking up a fuss. Emma had no issues with clawing the face off him if need be and told me not to worry about him coming to our front door. Then came the next part of the plan. I waited till a week or so before Jake and I were supposedly moving into our own flat and stole his phone for a few minutes. He'd stopped caring about leaving his phone unattended and would sometimes flat out brag about how lucky he was to be able to sleep with whoever he wanted and come home to a little B-word who'd make him dinner. So that day when he went for a shower, he wasn't all too bothered about taking his phone with him. Perfect. I went onto his phone, deleted my number from his contacts, and changed the name of his MM's contact as mine. Pleased, I went to the kitchen, smashed one of the plates. It was my mother's, but it was a cheap one from a local shop, and I did replace it as soon as possible. I left for work once everything was done. My mother had left for work a couple of hours prior, so she was safe. I just needed a reason for him to get pissed off. And oh boy, did he get pissed off. His first reaction was to text me, calling me all the disgusting names under the sun. Except it wasn't me he texted, it was his mom. I'd texted her in advance and told her that I hoped she'd forgive me, but she had to see what her son was really like. She'd never tried to defend him as much as she just hadn't known quite how bad his behavior was. She'd actually called him out a couple of times where he'd slipped up and been harsh with me when she was there. She went apeshit. I never found out exactly how their argument went, as she phoned him to scream at him and call him out for his crappy behavior, finally seeing how horrible her son was. It didn't help that she'd been sent screenshots of some of the times where he'd admitted to cheating. She was absolutely disgusted by her son's behavior and phoned me to apologize on Jake's behalf. It wasn't her fault, though. He's old enough to know how to act like a dang adult. He wound up telling his mom essentially that her opinion didn't matter as he'd be moving in with me anyways. Needless to say, when he called me on Facebook, after I deleted my number from his phone, I took some satisfaction in telling him that we weren't moving in together, that the trust fund wasn't real. I'd already told him that in the past, he just refused to listen, and that I'd moved in with Emma. I was called all the sluts and whores under the sun. His voice sort of turned to white noise after a while. I told him we were over and hung up, blocked him on everything. He had to run back to his mom and dad, his tail between his legs, and they took him back for a little while. Though, after a bit, the arguments became too much and his parents kicked him out. He stayed with a couple of friends for a few months before he managed to get his own place. His parents, especially his mother, have not been the same with him since. I still talk to his mom on occasion. Lastly, David and I took the liberty of sending screenshots of Jake's abuse to as many of the people he'd been hooking up with as possible. A couple of sleepless nights were spent trying to track people down on Facebook. Part of it was to get back at Jake, but most of it was just to make sure that none of them got roped into a full-on relationship with him and had to deal with all the crap I'd gone through. So there it is, my little story of pro-revenge. I know this is really long, so there is a TLDR below. I wasn't ever planning on posting my story, but I was scrolling through Facebook the other day, and one of Jake's new accounts popped up in the People You May Know section. After talking with Emma about it, she suggested posting it here. I hope it fits in this subreddit. Bye! Thanks for tuning in to The Sire. If you enjoyed today's content, smash that like button. Subscribe for more unique insights. Catch you in the next one.